My talk today argues that the contemporary field of acoustic ecology has yet to seriously question and redress its history of problematic racial politics, and in many instances continues to reinforce white normative modes of environmental listening. I'll demonstrate how both foundational and contemporary acoustic ecology philosophies and concepts largely fail to highlight the connections between the politics of noise and quiet and the politics of social difference. I therefore propose a call for renewed acoustic ecology praxis that resists racial colorblindness and instead adopts intersectional approaches to soundscape research. Now, I want to start by providing a brief survey of the dominant authorship and citation practices of acoustic ecology journal publications to show how the perspectives of Indigenous, Black, and scholars of color are seriously underrepresented. I argue for an inclusive approach to acoustic ecology scholarship that starts with critically examining how the subjective perception of aural environments is deeply influenced by the racial, class, sexual, gender, and disability identifications of listeners. The key academic journals that publish soundscape literature are arguably Organized Sound, Leonardo Music Journal, and Soundscape, the Journal of Acoustic Ecology. A search using the keywords acoustic ecology or soundscape in Organized Sound's online database yields very few articles by scholars of color. I counted approximately 5 or 6, and 2 of those being my own articles. Over the past decade, only the 2012 and 2019 issues of the Soundscape Journal contain Indigenous authors and authors of color, but once again, only about 5 or 6 articles in total. This raises the question as to whether the field of acoustic ecology is marginalizing certain voices and perspectives, especially those from and about racialized and Indigenous communities. Non-white scholars are sometimes cited in the bibliographies of Organized Sound and the Soundscape Journal articles, but these articles seldom discuss race or Indigenous politics explicitly. One possible reason for this is, as communications scholar Chakrabarti suggests, are the exclusionary institutional structures of academic peer review, as well as the lack of racial diversity in journal editorial boards all too often. Now, some may propose that the acoustic ecology canon is not exclusionary, but rather there are very few BIPOC scholars studying soundscapes. Today, I want to challenge this assumption by suggesting that we change the current criteria for what is deemed true or rigorous soundscape research. Prominent soundscape publications primarily draw from the fields of electroacoustic music, applied acoustics, and urban planning, among other fields. Instead, I'd like to briefly survey for you some alternative scholarship that emerges from fields that in general are not affiliated with acoustic ecology, but I argue should be. For instance, sociology, critical race studies, and critical geography. R. Murray Schafer famously associated urban life with so-called lo-fi, undesirable, noisy soundscapes dangerous to our health. More contemporary acoustic ecology research similarly foregrounds the harmful effects of noise. Applied acoustics researchers have studied the impact of urban noise on sleep and children's learning, for example. Now, indeed, critically listening to environments is essential to designing healthy and safe neighborhoods. However, Gaskia Uzunian cautions against the assumption that noise is always a negative social phenomenon. She points out, quote, the very idea of noise pollution, which has been the historical motivation for acoustic ecology, and likewise efforts in noise legislation, presumes that certain sounds are acceptable while others are not. What often follows from this is a binary division whereby natural sounds are considered desirable, whereas man-made sounds are deemed noisy. I propose such a dichotomy ignores some noise that may contribute to a sense of community for systemically marginalized groups. Marie Thompson, for instance, listens critically to noise protests at prisons and immigrant detention centers, where sound is used to traverse walls and borders in subversive ways. Unfortunately, important studies like hers are not cited in soundscape journals and are only cited in sociology and critical geography. Tom Rice proposes the concept of acoustical agency in his examination of British prison soundscapes. He argues that prisoners serve as active environmental listeners who resist everyday oppressive soundscapes, such as the common sound of slamming metal doors or guards shouting. Prisoners do so through their own noise via loud music from portable stereos or cell-to-cell shouting as a subversive form of communication between inmates, Rice argues. Rice's research on acoustical agency is primarily cited in building acoustics, criminology, and performance studies journals, with very few references in soundscape journals. Now, a common research area of acoustic ecology is acoustic architecture. See O'Goyard and Torque's widely cited book, Sonic Experience, or Blesser and Salter's book, Spaces Speak, Are You Listening? So it's especially surprising that Rice's research on prison acoustic architecture and environmental noise is not being cited more often in the acoustic ecology field. Schaefer and Truex assert that the aim of acoustic ecology is to draw attention to acoustic imbalances due to noise that have unhealthy or inimical effects. However, we should think about who has the authority and lived experience to gauge whether the relationship between specific communities and their sound environments is ecologically balanced and healthy, as this is a complex and nuanced issue. In much dominant soundscape literature, there is an implied aesthetic moralism often, whereby most forms of noise are categorized as undesirable. In contrast, I argue Rice and Thompson demonstrate how soundscape scholarship can evolve to a certain degree to embrace a nuanced ecological understanding of environmental noise. So I want to propose the term community-centered noise to describe specific manifestations of empowering, disruptive, and resistive noise, such as those described by these understudied scholars I've mentioned. The late soundscape scholar Andrew McCartney was often a critic of the often normative assumptions that we find in acoustic ecology. In her 2004 essay published in the Soundscape journal titled, "What is a Sound Ecologist to Do?" McCartney recounts witnessing while on a sound walk, a white cyclist spitting on a South Asian man. Although the Lachine Canal Park in Montreal where this occurred may have been visually beautiful, McCartney points out how the sonic imprint of this racist attack was almost inaudible. She comments, quote, "Humming tires on pavement, an almost silent swerve, a hork and a quiet spit. The turbaned man said not a word," end quote. This leads McCartney to challenge the tendency among acoustic ecologists to assume low levels of urban noise is indicative of an ecologically healthy acoustic environment. To quote her once again, "If I had been watching the decibel meter while measuring sound levels, I might have paid little attention to this event. In the field of sound ecology, it may be tempting to assume that an acoustically balanced soundscape indicates an ecologically balanced environment, to focus on achieving quiet. Yet social oppression can create silence too, and it's important to ask whom is silencing whom in such cases. Now, what McCartney is highlighting here is the failure within dominant discourse to seriously consider how sound ecology is always intertwined with human rights and social ecology. She does not explicitly adopt a critical race studies framework in this essay or elsewhere, but her essay is groundbreaking in how it can be read as an initial call for more critical and intersectional modes of environmental listening. Now, surprisingly, this specific article by McCartney has only been cited approximately 6 times since it was first published almost 2 decades ago, which suggests that McCartney's important critique of the white normative listening practices has still not made a significant impact on the soundscape studies canon. Thankfully, there's a growing community of Black scholars working at the margins of soundscape studies addressing this lack of intersectional research. Ethnomusicologist Allie Martin states, quote, "I utilize sound walks to humanize myself in a soundscape that would otherwise disregard my sonic perceptions in favor of a white hearing as the default standard of sound." Martin is aware of how her intersectional identity as a Black woman informs her sound walks through policed and gentrified neighborhoods. The environmental soundscape she navigates are exclusionary in the way she sometimes is confronted by both sexist catcalls and racist slurs simultaneously. So this brings me to my main argument that dominant modes of environmental listening put forth in acoustic ecology literature is a type of listening that often does not see or hear race explicitly. It fails to listen intersectionally to the ways BIPOC communities hear their everyday environments. I would call this colorblind listening. Race and queer studies scholar Sarah Ahmed argues that it has become commonplace for whiteness to be represented as invisible, as the unseen or the unmarked, as non-color, the hidden referent against which all other colors are measured as forms of deviance. The ideology of colorblindness reinforces the unseen nature of whiteness. For sound theorist Jennifer Stover, it's the dominant listening practices of white society and their politics of noise that often render this seemingly invisible whiteness audible. In her 2016 book, The Sonic Color Line, Stover outlines how listening practices are deeply racialized. The sound of hip hop, pumped at top volume through car speakers, for example, has become a stand-in for the bodies of young Black men in American culture. Stover suggests that the noise ordinances often facilitate racial profiling without ever having to explicitly cite race as the driving factor. So I argue it's fruitful to draw from Stover's study of white dominant listening practices to more generally understand how colorblindness informs the ways in which the overwhelmingly white field of acoustic ecology listens to more mundane and everyday noises, silence, and sound marks. For instance, in the first months of lockdowns in many North American and European cities during the spring of 2020, many were inspired to record and study the so-called hushed cities. Many acoustic ecologists and sound map creators implied a possible silver lining of the pandemic, that being healthier natural environments and soundscapes. But in many cases, this discourse overlooked or underheard the everyday mundane noises of crowded housing, transportation, police, and ambulance sirens that many working class communities of color in Canada and the United States had been hearing prior to the pandemic and continued to hear even during lockdowns. Sound maps failed to acknowledge the soundscapes heard by racialized essential workers who drive taxis and Ubers or work in hospitals. This marginalized sector of society did not hear the same sonic utopia of silence that was predicated in dominant discourse at the time. Also, when Black Lives Matter protests pierced through the pandemic silence during the summer of 2020, there were very few protest recordings uploaded to these sound maps. Also, whiter and more affluent neighborhoods remained quiet, in part at the expense of Black and Brown people being heavily policed and fined during the pandemic. Contrary to some theories of urban quieting, research has shown that noise complaints in some major American cities, in fact, increased significantly during the pandemic. So once again, McCartney's warning to acoustic ecologists that social oppression can create silence is relevant here. I conceive of the aggressive policing of noise as forced quiet, that is harmful to marginalized communities in particular. Instead, we should encourage what I call recuperative quiet, which has therapeutic benefits for certain marginalized groups in addition to the general public. And it's a type of quiet that affords agency. Now, to be clear, I'm in no way downplaying the threat of noise pollution. I also study what I call normative noise, such as the quotidian soundscapes of capitalism, construction, gentrification, and transport that disproportionately threaten the health of marginalized communities, as Amanda Gutierrez and others remind us. This noise is unique from the transformative community-centered noise I discussed earlier. So we need a more nuanced understanding of how both noise and silence can, in specific instances, depending on the needs and lived experiences of communities, of course, have social and health benefits or harms in other cases. The question now remains, how do we move towards intersectional acoustic ecology frameworks and urban acoustic design that unsettle the white status quo? Truax argues that the work of the World Soundscape Project has contributed to a contemporary understanding of acoustic sustainability that can be defined as our ability as a culture to live within a positively functioning soundscape. Now, if we are to have a comprehensive understanding of positively functioning soundscapes, acoustic ecologists and urban planners should closely listen to instances in which urban noise is a marker of healthy community building as well. This would involve drawing on critical sound research that's taking place outside of established acoustic ecology academic circles. One example of such research as taken up by Black critical geography scholar Brandi Summers is how Black communities in Washington, D.C. challenge the process of gentrification by reclaiming space and resisting capitalist dispossession through their own cultural production. Go-go music, a subgenre of funk music, native to DC, is played on speakers outside storefronts to bring the Black community together, chat, dance, and take up space amidst numerous noise complaints, mostly from white gentrifiers in the neighborhood. I would classify such sonic resistance as community-centered noise. To foster acoustically sustainable and socially equitable cities, sounds of noisy resistance should coexist with therapeutic nature sounds and dedicated quiet spaces that do not require policed and forced quiet. But epidemiologist Erica Walker identifies how cities' regulation of noise overlooks systemic issues that result in communities of color living in areas plagued with noise pollution. She writes, quote, "As a person who grew up both poor and Black, I've always had a problem with the term quiet. It always seemed like a kind of power that not everyone can exert. Still today, it seems like a type of privilege afforded to a select few. It seems too much like saying shut up. As a noise researcher and community activist, I'm interested in peace, which requires dialogue, a two-way street, a compromise. And sometimes peace can actually be quite loud," end quote. The soundscapes of Black Lives Matter protests and amplified go-go music speak to Walker's strive towards louder forms of peace and dialogue that unsettle the status quo of acoustic ecology, orthodoxy. Of course, marginalized communities also benefit from and may desire therapeutic silence and nature sounds. Additionally, a truly intersectional acoustic ecology praxis should avoid applying neurotypical norms of aural perception when determining if a soundscape is acoustically balanced and healthy. Some neurodivergent communities, including autistic people, with a heightened sensitivity to sound, often experience mundane noises in drastically different ways from dominant neurotypical society. There is already a growing body of research into aural diversity within acoustic ecology, which I argue we may draw on and expand upon. Furthermore, when strategically devising methods for ensuring that certain city spaces have recuperative quiet with audible nature rather than harmful traffic and construction noise, soundscape researchers and urban planners should make sure to also protect what Allie Martin calls equitable soundscapes. These soundscapes are, quote, spaces in which people who have been marginalized and disenfranchised are able to speak and to sound without facing retaliation or criminalization. So to conclude my talk, the criminalization of racialized sound making often takes the form of noise complaints or violent police suppression of protest soundscapes. Therefore, I propose that equitable soundscapes can incorporate both community-centered noise and recuperative quiet simultaneously so as to imagine futures with inclusive and healthy environmental soundscapes.